We're thrilled, ladies and gentlemen, to get into the first session of today. Please allow me to introduce our panellists. It's incredible to me that these two women working right at the heart of this crisis are in fact our panellists today. They've given their time to tell us of their experiences. Please welcome Kate Colvin and Amy McVie to the stage. As a moderator, I can't believe that as I say, there's people like you are here to answer our questions today. Kate Colvin, I'll come over to you and I'll introduce you over there. I'm not sure if any different numbers they are. Handheld one. And I'll take this one. So we have handheld 5 and 1. Thank you very much. Now, Kate Colvin is the Chief Executive of Australia's national peak body on homelessness. She's spent her career dedicated in some form or another to social justice, including more than 20 years in leadership roles in homelessness and housing and the youth welfare sectors. Please welcome Kate. And Amy McVie is the Chief Executive of the Queensland Council of Social Service. As a community lawyer and human rights advocate, Amy led the successful Human Rights Act for Queensland. Amy has qualifications in communications and law. Her work as a lawyer focused on human rights and discrimination, guardianship, estate planning, child protection and domestic violence. Please welcome Amy. Kate, I'll go to you first. What's the extent of this housing crisis nationally and how is it affecting women and families?
We can all see out there in the community that the extent of the housing crisis in terms of growing visible homelessness, of course, in the women's homelessness sector, we know that a lot of the homelessness is not the homelessness that we see, and we see that in terms of people coming into services, the numbers of women and children and young people growing. And, just some sort of figures, I suppose, that highlight that issue. We've got rents since 2020 as a little bit of a slowdown, but since 2020, rents have increased across the country 41%. So that's just, the average new rent is $166 more than it was. And of course, some people have had rental increases that are much bigger than that. And those rental increases are forcing really terrible decisions and people not able to meet their basic needs and not able to meet the basic needs of their family because of those rental increases. But I think the thing that we perhaps focus on less than the rental increases is actually the impact of the really record low vacancy rates. And I think that this is where I see actually sometimes more of an impact on women and children and young people. And that's because, what we know is that we have rental market discrimination. And so if there is 50 households or even 20 households competing for a rental, it's very unlikely that it's going to be the single parent or the Aboriginal family or the young person who's fled a violent home who's going to have the opportunity of renting that property, even if they could afford the rent, which often they can't, but even if they could. So what we see is that the lack of availability of homes at that cheaper end of the rental market is just having this terrible impact. And of course, nationally, we know we've got a shortfall of about 640,000 social housing properties. So we've not seen the level of commitment to addressing that crisis from either federal or state governments yet. And I think that's one of the big priorities for this next period.
Amy, can you paint the picture for us in Queensland? What does it look like here? I know that we're all nodding in here when Kate's been talking about the rent as an issue.
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. And Kate's really painted a very accurate picture, but we would say that Queensland is really the epicentre of the crisis. And many of you coming here today would have seen with your own eyes Queenslanders who are currently sleeping in tents, and we know that many are sleeping in cars, and families are permanently living in hotel rooms. The scale of the crisis in Queensland is huge. So we have about 300,000 Queenslanders currently with unmet housing need. And to put that sort of into context, that's about double the population of Cairns Queenslanders who don't currently have their housing needs met. So in addition to that, if we look at our social housing register, and although we do know from last year's Auditor General's report that the social housing register is a really poor indicator actually of need, but we do know that it's grown by 75% across the last 4 years, that people are waiting on average more than 2 years on the social housing register, and that half of those households include a person with a disability. We also know, as Kate pointed out, that the rental market is under extraordinary pressure. So not only do we have really record low vacancy rates, but rent inflation, so the cost of renting has grown more in Queensland than any other jurisdiction, and it's particularly stark in regional Queensland.
So can I just drill down on that a little? You said that that's grown over the last 4 years. Is Queensland importing a homelessness problem? I know that's just an anecdotal, silly thing to say, but can you speak to that? We hear it quite a bit about the population movement from the southern states. Is that what's causing it?
Look, population growth is certainly a factor in terms of why Queensland is experiencing the national housing crisis in a particularly acute way. And we know as a result of COVID, we did have record interstate migration, so it's a contributing factor. But this crisis is decades in the making, and it is the result of successive governments, both at state and federal levels, really ignoring the problem. The basic fact is we don't have enough housing for our growing population, and there's currently no plan federally or at a state level to address that, to actually look at what is the current state, like what is the need in this country. And there's been some excellent work done by Hal Paulson and his team at UNSW to actually look at what the current need in the community is, or have a really good guess at that. We also need to model what future need looks like, and then we just need to develop a plan based on that. But what I think is lacking at the moment is a real mission-driven ambition. And when I say mission-driven, I'd say we need to have a cultural expectation in this country that everyone should have access to housing, and that should be really our North Star, both at a national and state level, in terms of what a housing plan should deliver.
Kate, I'll get you to ask. I'll ask you about what the role of government is in ending this crisis. Are they listening, and are they doing enough right now?
Look, great question. And I think one of the things that I sort of feel excited about this year is the federal government have committed to doing a national housing and homelessness plan, so a 10-year plan around housing and homelessness. Now, when we've all sort of seen government plans before, and sometimes they end up just describing the problem, describing what's already being done, and maybe having a handful of small initiatives. And I think there's some prospect that that might be the case for this plan. But certainly our ambition for the plan and what government could do with that national housing and homelessness plan is make it a plan that's about setting that mission-driven ambition that everyone has a home, and make it a plan about ending homelessness. And I think that what that would invite is us to look at what are the drivers of homelessness. And of course, people having access to housing that they can afford is really critical in terms of both preventing and responding to homelessness. But as you all know, there are other factors that need to be talked about in a plan to end homelessness. So we need for people to have adequate incomes, and that's something that the federal government in particular can play a really important role in. I mean, we've seen rents increase across the country, 166 dollars, we've seen people have increases in income support. You know, the increase that the previous government made and the increase that the current government made in the last budget, which are a sort of total of $56 increase. So there's not enough being done in terms of people having adequate income support, but also the huge gaps that we see in homelessness service delivery in terms of people having the support that they need to thrive. So instead of just looking at responding to children who come to homeless services from situations where they've had to flee violence or neglect in the home, what is being done to provide families with the support and provide children who are struggling with the support that they need to thrive so that homelessness doesn't occur in the first place? So these are all questions that I'd like to see the National Housing and Homelessness Plan ask and then seek to answer. And then I think we'd be a long way towards making homelessness much more rare.
Can you add the Queensland context to that?
Yeah, sure. So I think it's really important that we keep all levels of government accountable when it comes to solving the housing crisis. So we do need that really ambitious plan that Kate has outlined at a national level. But then we need an interlocking state strategy and plan. I think, everyone that's been listening to the news this morning would have heard federal politicians talking about the HAF, the bill that's going back before Parliament to establish a fund which should increase funding for housing. And I think it's a little bit disappointing that we're getting distracted about what a funding model might look like that might deliver more housing. We need to lift the conversation up and actually talk about the plan that Kate's just outlined. So rather than get to the tactics on how we're going to deliver the housing, let's have a national conversation about what we actually want our country to look like. And the state government has a big role to play in that. We have recently heard our housing minister respond to our call for a 10-year housing plan, and we're working with government to make sure that plan has adequate ambition, and that ambition should be ending housing need in Queensland. We want to see really transparent supply targets. The report that Hal Paulson did for us this year showed that we need about 11,000 new social and affordable housing dwellings per year for the next decade to really end the crisis. And we get all of these, there's an announcement every day at the moment from the state government on what they're doing on housing. So it can become really difficult for us to add up, well, what are those commitments? Is that going to make a difference? A lot of the time it's government re-announcing stuff that they've announced many years ago, and there isn't adequate transparency around those announcements. So the housing plan should make the commitments really clear. We need to know how many houses, what kind of houses, what do you mean by affordable housing, where's the housing going to be delivered, and by when will people be moving into that housing. And in addition to that, we need better laws for tenants. We need a fairer private rental market. And so that housing plan should also focus on security, keeping people in homes when they have a roof over their head.
Gives me a chance to make a plug for journalism, really. It's important to say to these ministers, you've made that announcement before. We're not going to applaud you all over again, So, Kate, that you may not have heard on the way in, the Prime Minister speaking on RN this morning, he was asked, are we in a housing crisis? He wouldn't say the words, but he said we have a supply problem. Is it frustrating for you to hear that kind of discussion? And just for those that might need clarification, this bill that's being reintroduced to the Parliament today, that's talking about funding. It's not talking about what you are saying needs to be addressed as part of this national homelessness plan.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, while I do think that the Housing Australia Future Fund it's a good commitment and it puts money on the table to deliver housing. And we are talking about 10,000 30,000 properties over 5 years when we've got a shortfall of 640,000. So it's neither the enemy nor the complete solution. And the question around, do we have a housing crisis? I think it's impossible to answer that question other than to say, absolutely, we have a housing crisis. And it's not just a problem of general supply, because the particular problem that we have is that the private market is simply no longer delivering rentals that are affordable to people on low incomes. So that's not a general problem of supply. It's a problem of the cost of land and the cost of construction, all the elements that go into delivering housing, having risen much faster than people's incomes at that lower income level, so that we now have essentially a structural flaw in the private market that needs government intervention to address. I mean, we just can't have, when Amy talks about what kind of country do we want to be, we simply cannot be a country that does not provide housing opportunities for people who are low-income workers, let alone also we need there to be housing opportunities for people who are in a situation where they're not in work and are relying on Centrelink benefits. So we don't want this country to be like America, where it's the commonplace thing for someone on working in a shop or doing another kind of low-paid job to be essentially homeless. That's almost an expectation. And I think that's where we are now for many people, but we're hurtling down a path of that being very, very commonplace, and it's simply not acceptable.
I don't want to get bogged down on this bill, but I do want to just talk about, obviously it's very timely for us to be talking about this housing bill today because it is being reintroduced to Parliament. Are we feeling any effects of that now not being passed? There's a threat of a double dissolution election. How do you two both kind of watch the news and just say, just get it done?
Look, I think I'd return to that original comment, which is to say, really, when you listen to what politicians are saying across political parties, sometimes I feel like they're reading my key messages from the media I do. Everyone's saying the right things, but when you look underneath those words, no one is yet doing what is required to get us out of this mess. And so the distraction, I do think it's a bit of a distraction at the moment to be focusing in on the Housing Australia Future Fund. As Kate said, it is a positive step forward. It is putting supply on the table, but it is one small piece of a much bigger picture. And it's that big picture that we need to be focused on. If this bill wasn't to pass, it wouldn't be the end of the world in terms of there are other ways to deliver supply. And you might even ask yourself whether we need legislation to establish a fund, because here in Queensland we have the Housing Investment Fund, and that you will recall that there was no debate about that because it was established without legislation.
What is the role of the community services sector in solving this problem?
In solving the problem of the housing crisis or in solving homelessness?
Let's go both.
Look, I mean, I think community housing plays a really important role in the overall housing market, and you see a lot of really bespoke housing solutions offered to different groups who are homeless, and I think often that sort of innovation comes most from community housing, and of course also often community housing construction is cheaper per unit of housing than other options. But I think I just probably want to focus on the broader question, because we're always talking about housing and because it is so important, but it's not the only element, and there's really important work done by the homelessness service sector. And just hearing Aisha talk before about the support that made such an enormous difference. I mean, you simply cannot put a child into housing and expect that they will thrive when they've had a series of traumatic experiences. Children need support to stay connected to education, to learn the skills that you need to learn to transition to adulthood, to have the emotional support in those dark times when you're trying to find a way forward. So that's the important work that the homelessness service system do with children and young people. But it's also the work that many of you do, and which is incredibly important with women and children fleeing violence, who it's not just about fleeing a traumatic situation into housing, even if housing was available. It's about pulling all of the parts of a life back together that need, when someone's head is so full of the trauma and stress of homelessness, having a worker who's got a steady hand and who's not in the thick of that trauma to help re-enroll kids in school, to help connect to the lawyers, to help connect to the health services. All of those parts of the puzzle are also really important. I think, just a big shout out to homelessness sector workers and the important work that they do.
Amy, community sector, homelessness and housing policy.
Sure. So I think community services are part of civil society, and they do deliver really essential services into our community, like Kate said. But we are also part of the machinery that's required. Machinery is probably the wrong word, but the machinery that's required to make sure we have a healthy democracy. And by that I mean we all have a role to play in making sure that issues in our community are identified and we build movements around those to get solutions. So QCOS is currently coordinating a campaign called the Town of Nowhere campaign. And Bronwyn is from QCOS down there. She'd love to talk to you more about the campaign. But in terms of the concept, originally when we launched Town of Nowhere, it was to say if everyone on Queensland's social register came together and formed a town, it would be Queensland's 5th biggest town. You might have noticed, though, that I said in my first comments that we now know housing need to be about double the size of Cairns. So if the Town of Nowhere was a town, it would be looking more like one of our biggest cities. So the reason we launched this campaign is actually that it was around 2020 that our sector started saying really, really clearly, this housing problem is something we have never seen before. And it didn't matter whether I was talking to a domestic violence service, a health service, a families and children service, or a housing service. They were all saying housing's the number one thing, Amy, we need to do something about it. So I feel incredibly proud of our sector because 21 of those organisations came together and co-funded the Town of Nowhere campaign, and we've been working really collaboratively together on raising the issue of the housing crisis in Queensland. We have seen our state government inject a further $4.9 billion into housing since we commenced our campaign. But as you've heard both Kate and I talk about, we're nowhere near done, and we really need everyone to get involved in pushing for much more ambitious plans at both a federal and state level.
I wanted to talk about the role of advocacy because you two women here at the heart of this problem. Can I get you to reflect on the role that advocacy's played for Homelessness Australia?
Look, I think advocacy, it's just enormously important, and the work that homelessness workers do and seeing every day the sort of fault lines in our community and often, very often not having the resources to provide the support and housing that people really need. The advocacy is a it's a necessary response to that. It's the sort of antidote to that dysfunction. It's because we have to say we have to do better. And so I think for me, the focus over the coming year is really about pushing the federal government's level of ambition around the National Housing and Homelessness Plan, and we're really going to need everyone in the sector to join with that call for the government to make that. We don't want a plan about homelessness that has a handful of new initiatives down the back of it. We want a plan to end homelessness, and I think that's an ambition that we all share. But I think another campaign that I've been really involved with, which formed in a very similar way to Town of Nowhere, was the Everybody's Home campaign, which is still going and which has really been pushing the federal government around the need for more social housing investment. And so I think, it's wonderful. There's been many Queensland organisations that have participated in that. And as Amy said, there's been a lot of wins and a lot of commitments made, but we're not there yet with the level of ambition. And one of the things I suppose I'd reflect about advocacy is that it sometimes feels strange when you're the person who keeps saying, and we need more social housing, we need more social housing. You think, but I've said it so many times. and yet one of the funny things about that sort of advocacy is that you have to say it again and again and again and again until it's done. And there's a sort of maxim about campaigning that it's when you start to feel sick of saying the thing that it starts to get momentum publicly. So I feel like we're getting momentum around the need for social housing. It's a very mainstream topic of debate at the moment, but we've got to kind of keep pushing until it's done.
Do you agree, Amy, that painting the picture for people, the Town of Nowhere, you've given us all an image this morning of a city twice the size of Cairns. Are you going to get sick of saying that to really hammer home how serious it is in Queensland?
Look, I hope I don't get sick of saying it, because I'm so invested in working with everyone on a proper outcome. And I think it would be a major disappointment to stop saying it until we're done.
I don't mean to be flippant. I apologise, but I just mean that what Kate just said about hammering it home, you do get surprised that people still aren't getting the message.
Well, I think we're at a really exciting point, because I think campaigns like Everybody's Home, which QCOS is a very proud supporter of, have done an excellent job in raising public awareness about the issue, building movements, talking to government, getting government saying the right things. So we're at this point now where we've got this mainstream public debate going on, and now's the time for us to kind of make sure we're working underneath that as well on the policy solution, to make sure that at the end of the day, we can stand up when our plans are released and say this is a good plan.
How do you escape this mental load of your work?
Oh, that's a good question. I think I think I carry the anger. So I think it's sort of partly about escaping it, but partly about I think we can't settle for what isn't good enough for our community. So it's sort of having that aspiration for what we want Australia to be. But then, I suppose I'll also, have a family and, dogs that need to be walked in nature and all of those kinds of things as well. So you have
lots of people here today, that
have a step aside from it as well.
Does the dog think, oh, wow, she's having a tough week. I'm getting lots of walks this week. Amy, how about you? How do you take on the battle but leave it behind when sometimes you need to?
Well, despite sometimes seeming like a little dark cloud, because everywhere I'm going, I'm yelling out about crisis, I actually think my job is a job of hope and optimism. When Rachel introduced me, she said I'm a lawyer by background, and I've worked a lot with really disadvantaged people in their biggest crisis moment. And I've seen some really, really troubling things happening to individuals because of systems that are not set up to support or assist disadvantaged people. And I must say that having an opportunity to be working on systems change, being able to imagine a different type of community, for me is a really hopeful job. It is something that makes me feel positive and proud and happy to be involved in. And I think I take that responsibility of hope very seriously, because I know that there are many people in our community who are in the most desperate of situations. And I want to take that responsibility of hope to try and be part of all of the work that all of you are doing too, which is to create something better into the future.
For each of you, a final question. I give you a policy wand. What do you do with it?
Oh, which thing to choose? I would like to see a commitment that delivers not just a National Housing and Homelessness Plan this year, but it built in so that every 10 years we're renewing. Have we made progress? What do we need to do in the next stage? So a permanent 10-year National Housing and Homelessness Plan that is renewed every 10 years.
Amy?
Well, I've probably already said mine, which is to have governments who are genuinely saying our priority is to end housing need in Australia and in Queensland. We're setting that ambition, and then we're getting the right people around the table to actually work out what we need to achieve that outcome. We have a cultural expectation in Australia that we'll have access to health, access to education. We don't always get there, but we expect to be able to get there most of the time. And I want to see us set that same type of expectation when it comes to housing.
Ladies and gentlemen, please continue that applause for our panellists, Kate Colvin and Amy McVie. Thank you. Thanks very much to Kate and Amy. We are very lucky now to welcome Auntie Louisa Bonner, who's going to make a formal welcome to country for us today.
To the ladies who are from the association that are pushing forward the work for the housing and that, thank you so very much. I hate things like this because I get very emotional. But Ipswich, I'm sitting here, I'm listening to the conversations, and I'm a community member out at Ipswich. There's a spare house in our street, by the way, Casey Street, Leichhardt, and I know it's a housing. So we've got homeless people in the streets there, just along the main street in Ipswich. It's a real eyesore. It's really, really sad too. We also had a recent death just after Christmas, I think it was, where a homeless person went over the local bridge. I knew that person. So, yeah, that's why I'm really grateful that someone's out there doing something to push that. You might need that magic wand. You might say, look, can you just move out of our way and just let me and community run, and we'll take it from here. Get over all the government bureaucratic, BS stuff. Yeah, my mum and dad, just to share a little quick story, my mum and dad, they're pretty aged and they have that support payment from Centrelink, but they've also looked after an older cousin of mine for a number of years, so you get that extra bit of money and stuff like that. And then my brother was with them too, and he's on a special disability payment too, and they all tried to get a house back down in Brisbane because they live out near Dalby Way, but they said they earn too much. So, that's probably something else that others could possibly be experiencing as well. And it was like, how can you earn too much? They're not even working. They get that payment because they need it, because they might have medication and stuff like that they've got to pay for. So there's a real disadvantage even before these people even get in to the housing thing. And I'm just talking from experience. I even had my niece, who had 5 children, camp in my yard until she got a place. But anyway, I don't want to rattle on about that and take up your time, even though it is very relevant to what we're talking about here today. So thank you again. I'm a member of the Juggera Clans group, and we're a subgroup of the Juggera language people, which is Brisbane is a big part of that. Our country starts from the port of Brisbane, roughly, runs along the border of Esk It even goes into S, but there'll be other families that claim that area. So, and then back out towards the bottom of the Toowoomba Range, right back down to Mount Barney, and then back over to your left-hand side on that border of Rough Downey, coming back up over the north side of the Logan River, and then back to the Port of Brisbane. So that's roughly Yagara language people's country, and then you have all the subgroups underneath it. Traditionally, when neighbouring clans would want to pass through country or come visiting and do trading and stuff like that, before they approach too closely, they would send up a fire signal just to let them know that someone's coming in. You probably don't want to find a spear, you know, close by otherwise. Or they'd send a messenger ahead with a message stick that would have the clan groups' totems and things like that on, so they were easily identified. Or a bull roarer, which you'd stand up on a small hill or get into a gully or somewhere where you could make a big noise. It's a little oval type long stick, about 40 centimetres long, tied on the end of a stick. It's got an oblique kind of shape, and spin it around and around. I did have a couple of videos, but I was too late to get that on there, so I might leave them with the guys that they can show you when you have a break, just put up there for a bit of entertainment. One's a little bit funny. The other one, the first one, is my nephew who made one and did it, and he was very excited that was actually working. That's what happens to blackfellas when we grow up in the city, see? But on behalf of my people, past, present and future, I would like to offer you all a warm welcome to country, so Wanya Daran, which means welcome to country. And just thank you for the acknowledgement of my people, and just to let you know that I really enjoy getting out and doing these welcomes to countries, because it does do something about reconciliation, about non-Indigenous people seeing me as a First Nations person, how I conduct myself, how I talk, and that builds that and develops that relationship between us. So thank you again for that opportunity and for the invitation to be here today. All the best.